Welcome to the first in a new 2024 series of the Fortuna Admissions Masterclasses. And of course, wherever we decide to start, we're going to be looking at the Harvard Business School. How well do you know HBS? As the admissions director, Rupal Gadia, and her team review thousands of applications every year for just 930 places in what is arguably the world's most famous business school. Candidates talk about leadership, aspiring to being a CEO, how they would discuss their passion for the case method. Nobody mentions the weather in Boston, but we'll be able to check on what that weather is like in just a few moments. At Fortuna Admissions, we work with an enormous number of applicants to Harvard Business School every year. And in fact, in round 2, which we just completed, we had a record number of admits, not just to HBS, but also dual admits. They got offers as well from Stanford. After all of that work and self-reflection, perhaps the hardest challenge was choosing which school. So if Harvard Business School is on your wish list in your future career and personal professional development, we're delighted that you're joining us for this session with 45 minutes and 2 colleagues that are true experts on everything that you need to know about applying to Harvard Business School. My name is Matt Simmons. I'm one of the co-founders of Fortuna Admissions, which is this dream team of former admission directors, associate deans, admissions from the world's top schools, whether that's Harvard Business School, Stanford, Wharton, and the rest of the M7 international schools like INSEAD and London Business School. And we give so much advice to individuals as they think about their next steps. So we hope that after this webinar, you will then register on the Fortuna website for a free consultation. We take those consultations incredibly seriously, looking through your resume, the schools that you're targeting, so that we can have a really in-depth discussion. An in-depth discussion is what I can promise in the next 45 minutes. I quickly learned that the secret of being a good presenter is to have great guests. And my panelists today, it's a joy to welcome Altrell Mills. Altrell is one of our expert coaches at Fortuna. He's from the Harvard Business School class of 2016. He can tell you all about the case method. He was also a co-president of the AU during his time at the school and a published author of 2 cases at HBS, and also very well known to anyone looking at Harvard Business School, Carla Cohen, the queen of HBS. She's one of our senior expert coaches, plays an enormous role in the success rates that I mentioned earlier for candidates applying to the MBA classroom in Boston. She was a former associate director at HBS. Altrell and Carla, thank you for being with us, and I look forward to sharing the next 45 minutes together. Just to give a sense for our viewers of what we will be covering, that idea of how well you actually know Harvard Business School. And we'll be talking about perhaps what lies beyond that, your authenticity and being genuine in the application. Harvard famously asks, what more should we know about you, for their one essay? So we'll be tackling that. Recommenders that play such a big role. And this word impact, I don't think we could use impact enough in the next 45 minutes. It's certainly something that the admissions team in Dillon House is looking for. And as we take you through the interview, the famous HBS 30-minute interview, and everything that you can do between now and round 1 to connect with the school. Now, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and turn over to both of you. Carla, I'd mentioned this idea of how well you know Harvard Business School from your perspective. It's a school that you love, that you were working at many, many years. And in fact, in the past, you've talked about the 6 C's of HBS. That sounds like a Michael Porter class. But tell us, share your impressions of HBS.
HBS, yes, one of the hardest decisions I ever had to make was leaving the school. It is an incredible place. Most people don't leave, so for very good reasons. The 6 C's that you mentioned, it really starts with what I think is so foundational to what makes HBS excellent, which is the culture of the school. The campus, the other thing too, is a residential experience. For most individuals, it is possible to live off campus, but the vast majority live on campus, and you become, as they're looking at your application, you become part of the family that's going to be, living with this incredible community. So, and the campus itself, I remember, it's something like 45 plus buildings on 45 plus acres, which is, most business schools have one building, or maybe a handful of buildings. So it's like no other business school in the world. And I think the Harvard brand, when I was leaving INSEAD and moving to the States, my ex-husband was moving to MIT. Very few people were like, I think I've heard of that, but Harvard Business School, wow, your wife is really going to a great place. So the power of the brand is something that, everybody knows Harvard. Everybody knows Harvard. So, the culture, the campus, the community of individuals that it attracts from all over the world. It attracts the best and the brightest from, whether it's the faculty, the students for sure, and they take that very seriously. The power of the intellectual capital that comes to campus every year, the alumni community too, is you have a connection to anyone, anywhere, basically. And they've been doing this forever. Then there's also the curriculum. It is the pioneer of the case method, and it is a place that is very verbal. You're going to be asked to speak up a lot, defend yourself, and in the classroom, also outside the classroom. Not that you're always on the defense, but it's a place that is really vibrant. So they're looking for people that are going to participate in everything, not just, the other C is the courses. So beyond the case method, the first year is the RC, the required curriculum. Everybody takes the same classes. You have the section experience of the 90 individuals. You become very close with those individuals, and my colleague will talk a lot more about that, I'm sure, and what that feels like. But it's special. It's very different, and it's something that I think separates it from all other programs. Nobody does it quite like them. Other programs, when I was at INSEAD, we used to win the award for buying the most HBS cases of any school in the world. I think they're working on changing that, but they pioneered it, and they've perfected it, and it's you really learn how to make better decisions and in the face of ambiguity, and it trains you in that. So courses, curriculum, and then there's clubs. They also want people who are not going to be able to participate just in the life of the classroom experience, and the case method, the cold calls and all of that. That's, I guess, the 7C, the cold call experience. But it's the clubs too. A lot of times people want to know what activities to put on the application, which we'll also dive into, but look at the clubs, look at what people do outside the classroom. There is so much, whether it's the music club or the private equity club, or, there was so much going on. One of the professors at the time, was sort of like, the hardest thing is really, it's like drinking from a fire hose. There's so much that goes on there that it's really easy. You're limited really only by your imagination, but it's easy to get overwhelmed. I've never seen any place like it. I've never experienced anything like it. I still visit. I love visiting clients there. It's so much fun to be able to go. And so still be able to experience that. I do play tennis sometimes on the tennis courts. So it's great. You have a lot. And it's a full experience, and it's intense. And honestly, there are very few days that go by that I don't miss it. You're connected to people too in ways that I think no other business school has quite been able to replicate. Now, it's not for everybody, so for those on the fence between Harvard and Stanford, that's a whole other conversation. But a lot of what I learned very early on in this process is that, yes, there's the M7 and that unites them, but there's so many differences. And so part of this process too that we help people with is figuring out which one is the right fit. Harvard is looking for fit in the application. You also need to think deeply about that, because you might want a more intimate program that doesn't have, around 1,000 people, or you see new faces every day, but we'll help you with that.
Well, you mentioned once you fall in love with Harvard Business School, you never leave. I was fortunate a week or so ago to interview Amy Edmondson, one of the staff professors who is ranked the #1 by Thinkers 50. She did her undergrad at Harvard, postgraduate studies at Harvard, and of course has built a wonderful and very influential career from HBS. Alterel, you had studied at Harvard University for undergrad, and then enjoyed a successful career in financial services before coming back. Did you miss it and want more? What was the appeal of going back for your MBA?
That's a really interesting question. Mostly, my Harvard undergrad experience was actually a big culture shock. So I'm from just outside of New York City. Going to school in Cambridge was very different, super expansive worldview that I really just wasn't prepared for. And I think that when I thought about what I wanted to do for business school, part of the appeal for going back to Harvard was I wanted to be inspired by people who were doing things that I'd never heard of. And I felt like from undergrad, I was constantly around people who were doing things that were just beyond my imagination. So for me, HBS was an opportunity to be motivated and inspired by folks. I remember having a conversation at Admitted Students Weekend with someone who told me that they wanted to work in agribusiness, and I didn't know what that was. And I just compared that to some of my other experiences at other admitted weekends, and I thought I wanted to be in a place where I don't know what everyone is doing. And that scared me, but also excited me. And I think that coming back to a place like Harvard, where I was less shocked by the culture, I was actually able to help a lot of my peers adjust to life in Boston, because there is a Harvard bubble, and Boston is a very particular city for lots of people. And there is a transition and some adjustment that very much is required for a lot of folks. And so I was happy to be able to leverage some of what I learned the first time for folks the second time I went.
Now, if I pick up on what Ultra's shared, Carla, and the idea of applying to a school with 9,000 applicants for those 930 places, and the idea of people doing things that you'd never even heard of or beyond your imagination, which sort of sets the bar very high. How do you then sort of bring it back to the individual? You talked about the importance of being yourself, being authentic and genuine. So do you sort of set aside that wild imagination to really ground yourself in who you are as an individual?
That's another really interesting question. From the applicant perspective, I think that's an essential part of the process, is really, understanding and leaning into, to borrow from Sheryl Sandberg, another HBS alum, but really leaning into that part of your identity where you stand out, and it's reflected also in the questions asked of the recommenders, what makes you different? So you don't have to be an all-star at absolutely everything, but you do need to have spikes. You need to have things that you're really good at and that you are aware of, and there needs to be evidence of that, and things that you can bring to the application. You don't have to be, again, the all-star athlete, but you will want to have some demonstrated skills and some good stories around that too. It's not interesting for them to hear everything always went my way and it always worked out. First of all, that's not how life works, so it's not something that they can believe. And they're looking for, they're looking for the two things really. It's like, does it make sense and does it sound true? And so what oftentimes happens is people will try to imagine that they have to be exceptional or perfect or flawless or always know exactly what they wanted to do. And that's definitely not the case. The vast majority of individuals going to business school are looking to do something different. And in many cases, you don't know what you don't know, as we were talking about. So I think that the thing that can be really helpful is that, you don't have to have all of the answers, but you do need to have self-awareness. You need to be able to discuss and not tell them, how you're different, but show them in terms of what you add into the application. And every piece of the application is there for a reason. So, we can talk more about different strategies for that, but there's so much that you can, cover and show them kind of what you will bring to the table so that you are someone who is distinctive in your own way and you have something to contribute to this community. They're not looking for people who look like everybody else. The whole case method would fall apart if you have everyone in the same room with the same kind of experiences and backgrounds. Where you really do learn is in that exposure to things that you've never heard of or considered, or a different perspective that completely challenges your point of view and helps you see the world in a more multidimensional way, because we tend to come in with our own lenses around things. And it does really blow up your sense of, wait a second, wow, there's so many other things that I hadn't thought about or considered, and your mind will be opened, you will be challenged, and you also need to be someone who's going to be able to do that for other individuals. So focusing on those parts of who you are is essential, and part of the consulting process that working with people is really digging deep there, helping you understand, like, how do you really stand out? What are you really good at? And even looking back at some of the questions that people are asked in the interview, like, what do you do really well? What do you not do well? And can you talk about that? You know, have you failed? The ones that are like, have I failed? That's the scariest answer ever. The best answer is, you know, I remember in one interview, this individual is like, I mean, you got to be more specific. Is it, you know, a recent experience, my most spectacular failure? You know, what are we talking about here? And that comfort with understanding that this is part of the experience of getting great, is that you have stumbled, you have picked yourself up, and being able to talk about that as excitedly as you can other things. And in fact, he ended with, in fact, I got lost on my way here. It was my favorite. I was like, you're in. We need people like you who will tell the truth about what you do well and what you don't do well, and what you've learned. What have you learned from the failures? Because they're your best educators. So that's what I help, and what we do with clients is really understanding, like, what is your story? What is your difference? What do you have to contribute? And a lot of that comes from exploring those different avenues.
We at Fortuna Ultra, we talk a lot about the awareness that Carla has mentioned. You know, there's an introspection. It's sort of it's a gift to be able to step back and truly think about your background, your experience, what you hope to contribute. As you think about that, in terms of perhaps humility, you know, someone can be too aware, too eager, and really want to, you know, put everything in the best light. So again, back to that authenticity. It's a very personal voice that shares your distinct personal story.
Yeah. So basically you're wondering, how do I help with clients sort of find that voice?
Absolutely.
So we have an intake process, and part of that process, we have a strategy session where we hear a few different things that folks are thinking through for ideas. We listen to, what have you failed at? What are your greatest strengths? And we try to figure out what are some juicy nuggets. The way I like to work is I like to have my clients start off by doing a first draft of their essays, and I like to give them live feedback to see how they respond. I think that for me, it's really critical to get a gauge for what lands well and what doesn't. And then we move from there. We can work a little more asynchronously. And what I found, especially in this past cycle, is that sometimes we're working through an essay prompt and the person is just not that passionate. And I'll say to them, I don't know how passionate you actually sound about this essay. Help me understand why in some of your other essays or other prompts, the passion really lights up. And then that'll lead to a conversation about, well, I thought that I should have said this. I feel like I need to do this. And I'll tell them, you need to be the person that the school is going to interview, because you need to be consistent, right? Like the voice needs to feel the same. And so if it doesn't feel like a good story that you want to tell, then don't tell that story, right? And so if I can't see the light in your eyes when you're telling me about an experience, don't just write it because you think it sounds good. I think that people can tell. If I can tell, I'm pretty sure the interviewers who have seen thousands of people can tell that that's really not who you are at the core. And so in terms of humility and authenticity, I really try to focus on, be authentic with your story because that makes sense. And then in terms of humility, I find that in many cases, women and minorities struggle with finding the right balance between um, speaking highly of what they've done and feeling like maybe they're bragging. And so what I tell some of my clients who fit into those categories, you just keep going and you sound extreme, and I'll pull you back if I think it doesn't make sense. But for a lot of folks, you know, it's second guessing. I've had clients who work in sales where I say, I'm really torn because your writing confuses me, but when you speak to me, you're so clear. What is it? And then it was, oh, I just get so caught up in my writing. And I'm like, no, no, I want you to write as you speak, because the way you speak is so clear. And that is the voice that I think is really important to come through. And so for me, I think that's the power of coaching, is that you can have another person who can say, something about what you're saying is either landing or not. Let me sort of just reposition you just a little bit so you can be that much more impactful.
Right. Now, finding that voice, Carla, because for the past 7 years, Harvard Business School, as part of their application, has had an essay question that says, what more should we know about you? To reach that point, they've looked at your resume, and they're really good detectives. Then, of course, they have these voice of recommenders. We'll be talking about recommenders in a few minutes. But what more should we know about you? Do they want to know about more decks of PowerPoint slides or an M&A deal that you successfully completed? We're, again, back to the personal on this one, right?
I can pretty much guarantee, unless there's some other element to that story, that they don't want to hear what they already know. They don't want you to repeat what, it's really the more is the essential part of that question. And in fact, this question has been there since when I first started dabbling at work with admissions at HBS. It was in 2012. So that question is powerful. It is deceptively simple. And now with the 900, it used to not have a word limit, but with the 900 words, you have to be disciplined about what do I speak about and how do I speak about that? And you've got to be able to, show them something and tell them something that they don't already know about you, and don't, talk about something that you wouldn't want to read either. Most of the admissions people, by the time they get to any application, it's like very quickly an exercise in how do I stay awake? It's a lot of it can be really boring, and it's like brochures of humans, and that's exhausting. And it's also really frustrating. And so when you actually find someone who has a voice, who has passion, who, is able to tell a story. And that's what I like to help people with, is like, what is your story? Where did you really, with the, impact, right? When did you make a difference? When were you actually a leader? And leadership comes in many different shapes and sizes, but what they're seeking is really, I'll say this a lot, but HBS wants CAL. They want to see engaged community citizens. So that's the community citizen part of it is the C. The appetite and aptitude. The aptitude they'll already probably know from your test scores, from your grades, and from recommendations, which we'll talk about that too. So you don't need to tell them that you're smart. You don't need to brag about yourself in the sense that like, oh, I sailed through this and that and the other. And this is not the space for that. They already have that information, but where you can talk about is like, where does this appetite, where did the success come from? What is motivating you? What is driving you? And what really is foundational to driving you to want to invest, because it's expensive. You're going to have to invest. Very few people get full rides to HBS, but it's time out of work. And so you're making a big commitment and investment in yourself, and they're looking for low risk, high upside individuals. And so low risk means you have a clear vision of what you want to do. And that doesn't have to be specific short and long-term goals. Not everyone has that. And so if you don't, we can help you with understanding and identifying what those might be, even if it's, I want to be in this space, but they're looking for leaders who will make a difference in the world. The mission of HBS, educate leaders who make a difference in the world. What difference are you on a pathway to make? Help us understand, where did that come from? Did it come from a place of struggle? Did it come serendipitously? Did it come from failure? Did it come from pushing against what your parents always wanted you to do, or whatever the situation is, or absolutely failing and then discovering that was not my path? That's super interesting. It's hard for people to do that because it feels like you have to just show off. But you very quickly become someone who's like, wow, the resume to pros again. No, thank you. I don't want to read that. I don't want to read about, the consulting project. Probably even the people that were part of it who would really understand it don't want to either. They're never going to really fully understand that part of it. And they will talk more about, tell me more about this deal. A lot of what we would see on the resume, to be honest, sometimes we would just take a chance on people. It's like, I don't even know if this is English. Like, it is English, but I don't understand it. So what does this line mean? Are you able to articulate what you do in a simplified way? And, back to earlier points, they don't want an English. This is not an English language program where you're trying to get into creative writing. It's like, it's not that. So being direct and straightforward and writing how you speak, is something that I think a lot of people don't do. They'll hire an editor. We are not ghostwriters. We are not going to write something for you. We are, think of us as you're like, yeah, we're editor-in-chief or chief strategist in some ways, but your story has to come through, which means your voice, as we were saying, it's like that who you are needs to kind of show up, and it needs to feel there's something really powerful about just that being authentic. And just the best essays are one where it's like, I just poured my heart out on paper, and then we pull them back and say like, okay, yes, you want to tell the truth, but not all the truth at all times. And we help set boundaries around that. And so, but you want to tell a good story. The success to so many things in life is being able to tell a great story and get people excited about who you are and want to know more. You don't have to tell everything. It's like a movie trailer. Get them enticed to be like, I want to see this movie. I see some stuff here that seems interesting. So it can feel like you have to share every success that you've ever had. And so when you get these laundry lists of like success, it's like, okay, but what's driving it? who are you? Who's the person behind all of this? And how did you get to be this way? And that's really where you will start to crack into what is going to be a successful application. Beyond the resume, beyond the recommendations too, is the short answer section of the application, which is valuable real estate to be able to stand out. And most people do not spend time to just, in plain English, what do you do? Being able to explain, what do I do? And have someone understand that versus jargon, that doesn't really mean much to anyone, that makes them wonder, do you really understand what you're doing? Use this as an opportunity to bring that same voice there so that it all feels, real and authentic. And like, I don't have to scratch my head to be like, what are you trying to say here? Don't make it complicated. Do not pick up a thesaurus. Use words that you would use in everyday language to explain things. And imagine yourself almost like at a cocktail party with your parents' friends trying to explain what you want to do. And that's actually much closer. So we really try hard to get people close to their own truths, because that's what's interesting, and that will always land. And when the last thing that I'll say about this is that I get a bit worried. There's so many clients who come to me like, what does Harvard want for, goals? What should I say? And I'm like, you can get an interview by coming up with something that you think is going to appeal to them, but it will completely fall apart. And all of this is a waste of time if it's not true, because they're going to see right through it. If you don't know, then you can own that. And you can say, I see potential for this pathway and this pathway. I know that what's driving me, I'm going to have to do X, Y, and Z. And we help you set boundaries around that. But you don't have to have a very specific, I know everything that's going to happen to me in the future and exactly how to get there. If you did, you probably wouldn't need to go to Harvard Business School. So you can, own what you know and own what you don't know. If you do know exactly what you want to do and how Harvard is going to help you get there, awesome. You can say that, and that is going to come through in the interview. So all of it is to say is that we help you figure that part out, but it's difficult, and being able to articulate that way. The favorite answer ever, that I had from a client was, she was basically at this point where she was like, I have no idea, really. I've done so many, I know not this. That's also very helpful. I don't want to do that. I did this and it taught me not this. Consulting, not for me. Banking, not for me. I want to do something different. I have these skills. But what she said, which I'll never forget, was she talked about, well, when I was a kid and people would ask me, it was like, I wanted to either be the president of the United States or Catherine Zeta-Jones from the musical Chicago, and so I loved that. And she's like, I'm at a similar impasse in my life right now, where I have these great experiences from these unique industries and I see where I excel, but I think I want to be at a big company, not a startup. I want to do something that is maybe a little bit more traditional and see if I can ascend there. But long-term, I want to be someone who changes X. And so that was powerful and that was real, and so resist the temptation to do what your friends did, to look at, other people that who got in and model yourself after them, because you're going to immediately become less authentic. And this is a search for authenticity. This is a search for, do we believe that you are who you are? And it's impossible to impress them with, the credentials and stuff like that. But what impresses them is being real and being able to tell them in plain English what you're seeking, what more they should know that's relevant, should be relevant to making a difference in the world. But that does open up a whole world of possibilities, which is exciting.
Well, I'm glad that we're recording this session, because I think the last 7 minutes had a blizzard of advice, incredibly insightful advice, and things to work towards. A couple of things to avoid. You're not sounding like a brochure. And helping you to find your truth. Now, Alteral, when we place that 900-word essay, and it is limited because, of course, in the case method, you had, a minute to say something insightful and worthwhile, contribute to the discussion, how that sits within the wider application, and, of course, recommenders, two voices of other individuals where you've had this close and substantive working relationship. So what is HBS looking for to learn from recommenders, to share insights and perspectives on you, the candidate?
And I know that Carla will probably have a much more informed perspective since she is right there in the room. My perspective I can tell you about my perspective as an applicant and as well as a coach. So as an applicant, I thought about who are the folks who are going to be able to speak about my journey in a way that makes sense. So a lot of what Carla shared, I would say I thought about people who saw me at my lows and my highs, and not just someone who could say he's the most amazing person, because it isn't always true, right? I looked for folks who I knew could speak to the nuance of some of the experiences that I faced at my first job, but also to the way that I was determined to push past some of those challenges. I also knew that they were pretty good writers, even though I know that not everybody has that privilege of finding recommenders who are going to be good writers. I sat with them and I gave them a packet of, here's what I want you to talk about. Let's have a conversation so that it's not just, hey, person, you seem really interesting with the right title. Can you speak about me? Because it just isn't really effective. So when I'm working with clients, I like to ask them, who are the full set of choices that you have available to you of people who can speak about you? And then tell me why, right? Not just what their title is, but did this person actually like you as an intern? Did this person actually like you as their subordinate? Really ask that question, and maybe also consider, have they written these kinds of letters before? Because in some instances, and I've seen this not just for MBA admissions, people will write stock letters.
Mm.
And you really don't want a stock letter. You want to make sure that you actually have the kind of relationship with the person who's writing your recommendation, that they are putting as much care into your admittance as you are. And I know that that can sound like a really tough mountain to climb, but I started my process at least a year beforehand. So I had an idea of who I wanted to write my letters of recommendation before I even knew what schools I wanted to apply to, because I knew who my advocates were. And so I would say, if you're here now and you're considering applying for the next cycle, you should be thinking about, who are the people who you think can speak well of your story, and try to foster the relationship even further and start speaking about what your ambitions are. Because I think that people who are invested in you now, at least a year ahead of time, will start to sort of will start to put pieces of the puzzle together that will make it make sense. I remember one of my recommenders, he was a VP at a bank before coming to Amex, which is where I worked before business school. And I expressed to him that I was really interested in learning a little bit more about finance. And I know that in my letters of recommendation, he spoke about my desire to learn finance. And I was in his office every week reading 10Ks and asking questions. And so he was able to speak to what Carla was mentioning about aptitude and recommendations, that I have a true interest in this. Now, I studied psychology in undergrad and I took one math course, right? And so the recommender being able to speak to my ability to have an appetite for learning supplemented the lack of quantitative skills that were demonstrated with my undergrad transcript. So it's sort of those kinds of things of thinking about your full story. And the last thing I would say is a piece of advice that I received was, you don't want to say the same thing in every data point that you give to the school. So your recommenders are giving a perspective that's a little bit different from your essays, a little bit different from your interview. They should speak to each other, but they should not all say the same thing. And so I knew, even when choosing my recommenders, that I wanted people who saw me in different lights, and that is important as well.
Well, this idea of pieces of the puzzle, presumably, Carla, as you think of recommenders, many applicants may have been in the same company for the last 3-4 years as they apply to business school, and naturally think of two individuals. For you, inside the admissions office, presumably what you wanted was distinct perspectives from each of them. If the second recommendation simply covered what the first one had shared, you haven't learned anything new about the candidate.
That's true, but there's also, it's more complicated than that, which is the good news and the bad news. The first thing that I'll say that I think is essential for people to understand is that letters of recommendation don't get you in, but they keep you out. A lot of the times what would happen is, we would see a phenomenal application, and then, as Ultra was saying, you don't get an advocate. It's a form letter. And so people will make all kinds of assumptions. They'll want someone with a big title, and it's just going to show up in the way that they write about you, that they're not that excited about you. So one other thing that I recommend that people do is, when you're asking someone to support you in this process, when you sit down and have that conversation, and it should be a conversation, and we help prepare you for that, but the conversation should be, can you write me a strong letter of recommendation? And then check their reaction. And you may not want to go in there committing to that. You might say, I'm considering this. If I do, move forward to this, and would you feel comfortable writing me a strong letter of recommendation? And if they're like, yes, that's one thing. And if they're like, absolutely, what do you need? And you want to find those people that are your champions. There could be situations, back to your question, around that you want to show, what did you talk about in your application? So, and it might also be helpful for them to do the bragging about you so that you can be humble in the application. So all of those successes that you might imagine should be part of an essay, where it's like, why am I not writing about all the successes at work in my essay? Which I do have a lot of people who may send their essays to family members. And I'm like, please do not do that unless you want to hire them to help you. The point is that you want them to be able to talk about those kinds of things because they have credibility. They have seen it. And so, they can talk about that in the, first question that they're asked around, like, how are you exceptional? And not just how are you exceptional? The other thing too, is that when people don't get in, or if they're looking for a review of what went wrong, I have these phenomenal grades. And it's usually the letters of recommendation. It's like, you also want to make sure that the letters of recommendation don't just say he did this, 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 and this. And because we would be sitting there like, is that just part of your job, or are you great at it? And why did it matter? Why did it matter that, why are you telling me this stuff? I don't know. Nobody who's in admissions, unless they were in, at the company before, which could be possible, they're not going to really understand. You have to contextualize it. So you want someone who's going to be able to spend time, who's going to talk about not only what you did, but why it mattered to the company. What was the impact of the work that you did? And then the second part around feedback. The reason that they want that, I would cut straight to the feedback before I would even read the first part of the question, because if I didn't get something there that sounded true, I didn't trust the stuff in the first part. Essentially, it's like, if you can tell me about a time that you gave some specific feedback and how did they react to that? So someone's going to have to be pretty close to you, or in a position of authority. So by default, you want to have, if you can, someone who has managed you, preferably recently, and who, as we were saying, who likes you, who enjoyed working with you and is excited to talk about that, but also is able to say, yes, I gave this person feedback. What was the reaction? And so there's the worst thing that you can do is, oh, he's a perfectionist, or he's, work-life balance, like something cliche is not fair. I don't learn about you. What they're looking for is growth. It's like any investment, right? You don't want to see, I gave him a little bit of feedback and then, or something, he didn't really have anything to work on. It's like, well, either you're not telling me the truth or you're not a great manager, either is not good, so you want someone who's going to be able to say, I gave him this feedback and I saw tremendous change, because that shows high upside. If you can get feedback and change your behavior, there's evidence of that. That's so powerful. And that's what I want. Then I'll trust and I'll read the first part, and then I'll look at the rest of the application and take it seriously. And it can alleviate a lot of stress and anxiety that you might have around, like, how do I talk about this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm bragging? You may not even have to talk about it. You've got your resume, you've got letters of recommendation. The other thing too is that a lot of people assume I have to have someone at my current company. Unless you're in consulting or in, oftentimes in private equity, it's like you've 2 years and, then you're out, or whatever the case is. And so it's part of the process is leaving. It's a little bit weird for them to be super excited that you're leaving, right? And to be writing this letter for you. So the admissions committee understands that it may not be possible, and you're not so arrogant to think I'm definitely getting in, that you would risk losing your job or getting a big bonus or promotion. So you can find out other individuals, maybe you've worked somewhere else, someone who knows you really well. It's great to have someone that you've worked with previously. Maybe it's from an internship before, or maybe it's someone that you report to indirectly that's not going to jeopardize your job. So we help you figure that out. But a lot of folks will make the wrong assumptions that end up being, I really do honestly think that each recommendation is 25% of the process. So 50% is your full application, but there's a huge other part of it. So many people don't spend the time on, who do I select? How do I help prepare them and talk to them and give them, they may not remember everything. So you can say, like, remember that we did this, and have conversations with them about it to make it so that they're able to articulate what they need to say. But they should be the ones writing it, right? You should not be writing the letter of recommendation. You can give them bullets to jog their memory, but for it to be a great full application that is going to move forward to interview, it is so competitive. And this is the easiest way for you to really stand out. So oftentimes applicants have this as an afterthought. And that is oftentimes where great people, their applications go to die. It's nothing wrong with them necessarily. They were just focusing on the wrong things. And so the way that you can really stand out is making sure that you're choosing the right individuals who can be advocates for you. And it may be that it's, someone completely outside of what you might have imagined initially. So we help you kind of understand what would land, what wouldn't. And yeah, it's a little bit, it's more complicated. So it may be different perspectives, but maybe you need two people to be consistently showing that this is a strength if you had a deficiency. So both people need to kind of like championed from a very senior perspective. Someone who's been successful, who is the CEO, actually knows you well, but has a totally different lens on you in terms of, they might have seen the same kinds of things and are validating the same skill set. It should all make sense, right? It should all make sense that it's like, if you have totally divergent views and one person is saying you're a phenomenal public speaker, and then the other person is saying he could work on public speaking, it might be difficult for them to digest. So there does need to be consistency. And in some cases, there may need to be totally divergent lenses to show that you're multidimensional. So long answer short, it depends. So
now, Alstrel, I'm coming back to you on recommenders, but also within a world of Chat GPT and a prompt for the recommender or for the candidate and their own essay that says, write me the Harvard Business School essay, and use the word impact a lot. So we can come back to that theme of impact, but how to best illustrate impact. But I think you had something else that you wanted to add on recommenders. Oh, I think we may have just lost. There he's back again.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, my Zoom unexpectedly quit. So I just wanted to add one quick point. I had a client who's French, and she said something to me that I think is super critical, that I want to just share with everyone. She talked about the importance of calling and meeting with the people that you're asking to be your recommender. And so I just want to double click on what Carla said. So I'm a millennial, and I like texting and I like emailing. And I say this just thinking about the audience who's probably watching this webinar, that it's really important, I think, what Carla said, to gauge the person's reaction and to do this in person. And while you might have an informal relationship, I really can't underscore how important it is to just sort of be a little old-fashioned in this context, to have the meeting in person where you're talking about the things like asking, can you write me the strong letter? It might seem, again, really outdated, but probably the people who are writing your letter of recommendation will be of this generation and will also sort of have that perspective. And so I would just say, do yourself the service of making sure that you don't introduce the idea over email as the first touch point for the person that you're speaking to.
Great. So this idea that Gen Z is applying to business school, but perhaps being supported by Gen X, and how we bridge all of that. So,
Yeah.
so this idea of impact, which perhaps is a word that we couldn't use enough, but no doubt you could use it too much. Altrel, how can you best illustrate impact?
So this is going to sound super cheesy, but the STAR method, which is what people use in interviews, I think actually is quite relevant here. So thinking about what's the situation, what's the task, what's the action, and what were the results. What I like to advise folks on, what I did myself, was thinking about what are the 2 to 3 stories that I want to tell, and what were the results of those stories. You're going to need to practice that story for an interview. And so when you're thinking about writing and impact, that is the surefirest way to quickly tell someone, as a coach, here are the 4 things I want to talk about. Okay, give me your star. That one's interesting. That one's maybe less so. Can you tell me a little bit more about the results, or a little bit more about what you did? Just makes it very, very easy to really double click into an area, or tell me more about that situation and how you got into it. So when it comes to impact, I think that's sort of one of the ways that you can think about how to put it in a framework that makes sense. I think for someone who's actually applying, it's really important not just to look at your resume, but what I did, which is very nerdy and very like me, I kept all of my performance reviews. And I looked back at my performance reviews to figure out what are the things that I had done. I also included those in the recommendation packet that I gave to my recommenders, but they knew me very well, and so they were accepting of a very big packet. But I would say thinking about what you've done, because you may forget. So I think one of the stories that I told in my interview was about something that happened in my first year of working, and I just forgot about it. It was about how I had to use Excel in a serious way for the first time. And it is just such a foundational memory of being thrown into the fire, not knowing what to do, and making something work, and how that actually wound up having a really big rippling impact later. But I had forgotten it, because by the time I interviewed, I was already pretty decent at Excel. And so thinking about, let's really start at the early points of what were some formative moments. Where did you get really critical feedback at an early stage? And so it's really trying to go back and figure out what were some learning moments for you, because that's where you can get some really juicy impact stories.
If we take Altrel's example, Carla, the importance of details, and going back to a performance review from 2, 3, 4 years ago, and almost reminding yourself of skills, developments, moments that you've had. How do you strike that balance between, bringing all of those details together almost forensically, but then being able to translate it perhaps into a bigger, accessible picture to the admissions office?
So the best answer that I can give here, I'll explain, but it's to show versus tell. And so part of it is, the details are everything. And those details will be, top of mind if they really happen to you, so to be able to bring someone back into that setting, to be able to show them these, formative moments, great way to phrase that. I think it's, when did you see change and growth? Oftentimes that's not when you're comfortable. That's not when you're cruising. Growth and comfort don't go hand in hand, but those are oftentimes interesting points. When was it really hard? When did you doubt yourself? Or when did you, get really difficult feedback? And how did you handle it? And how did you change? And there's no right answer to that question. You can go in a bunch of different directions that are all great. And so working with us to help identify which of these experiences are best to communicate, and how do you stitch it together in a forensic way like that, a forensic way, so that it's succinct, so that it's not just a mishmash of the kitchen sink of a bunch of star, models. It has to have that thread of continuity. And I'm just remembering one thing I forgot to mention earlier, which is the L in the CAL, which is leadership. Showing them leadership. And you don't want to talk about it. Sometimes we read these essays like they think it's leadership school here. It is a general management program. And so what are you hoping to gain from this? And a general management program can launch you into a bunch of different directions, right? But to make a difference in the world comes in many different shapes and sizes too. So being someone who is a leader, maybe you're someone who is a leader from behind the scenes. A lot of the best leaders in many cases are not the ones in the spotlight. So explaining those stories of what did you do that brought, there's some of the clients that I've worked with that are behind some of the coolest technologies that I use today, whether it's they worked at Apple and it was part of this launch for something on, what was their role in that, is actually very interesting in the sense of where were they challenged. So it doesn't have to be a professional space. Maybe you're discovering your true leader and your impact outside of work too. So that's also something as well, is that people assume that it has to be, they need to focus on in the essay stories that are related to their professional career. That may not be true. And so the most interesting nuggets, part of, again, the strategy session is really doing a deep dive and helping them move away from what they might have imagined, which is talking just about what I've done, how I've been successful in my career. That's not going to get the attention of someone. It's certainly not going to be the thing that unlocks the door at HBS. So you want to really push outside of what you might think they want to hear. But when did you really change something? When did you actually lead something that had an influence that, maybe was an initiative that you launched, maybe you solved a problem. And so it will never register on any resume or on LinkedIn that what you did basically helped avoid a terrible investment in something, and you spoke up for the first time and you were able to dissent, in a way that showed courage. But you don't want to tell them I was courageous when. You want to explain, bring them into the moment, the beating heart of like, I actually was able to say this really hard thing and I was terrified, and this is what happened. Could be a really great story. So that's a lot of what we do, but it comes in so many different shapes and sizes. And in many cases, you may not even fully appreciate the impact that you might have had. You can also, I think the performance review, keeping those is such great advice, Like just, again, a lot of the times I'm like, what are your key strengths? What are your defining factors? Go back to your performance review. If you're working for a company that does those things, and most companies do, you have very valuable intel. And it's also interesting to see how it's changed over time, right? So your first job, you may have struggled with X, Y, and Z, and then you were able to change and get that more under control. You don't have to be perfect at it, but you were able to mitigate the damage that whatever you were doing that wasn't ideal was causing. But you might have discovered other strengths or moved to a different department, found that, I was on the wrong seat on the bus and needed to be in a different, or maybe a different company. And so, you can have those different perspectives show up in the recommendation, but also in the way that you talk about the decision making. What is the white space on the resume? Like, why did you do these moves is also really interesting. Help us understand the story behind, what we're seeing in the bullets here, and in terms of this move to this move to this move. And I had some clients who were just so anxious about the fact that it's like, well, I did all these different things and it's not some beautiful cohesive story. I'm like, nobody knows exactly what they want to do at all times. None of us have a crystal ball. If you do, please email me separately. But nobody has a crystal ball. We don't know the future. So you don't have to pretend like you always knew exactly what you wanted to do. The process of discovery there can be complicated and it can be circuitous. I like this idea of the spiral staircase, to get to where you want to go. Sometimes it means trying out a bunch of different things. And so avoiding the temptation to make it all this perfectly, package it all together. If it's a little too perfect, that's suspicious. So you can be real about that part of the process that you went through in discovering that is leading you. Because if you're going to HBS, you're looking to not do what you're doing currently, right? So what is that leading towards, and what are you seeking in that process too, is not something that shows up on the resume. Also, stories about your integrity. If you can show them things like that, that doesn't show up on transcripts. That doesn't show up in the other parts of the application. Perhaps your recommenders could tell a really great story there, because they're looking for people with character. That is leadership. They're looking for courage, which often means, sorry, Brene Brown, I'm stealing from you, but it's vulnerability. It takes courage to open up and talk about things that, you would be afraid to otherwise. Now, you don't have to talk about everything, but there may be some specific stories that you never imagined that were formative for you that you can talk about. And so the spectrum of what essays have covered blew my mind, and those are the most interesting ones. So you might be really surprised that what your essay ends up being about is not at all what you would imagine going in, which makes me happy because then I feel valuable. But at any rate, I think that there's a lot of assumptions that I had even before I started this, and I was there's a lot, that I think people be careful of your own assumptions and make sure that you're not just taking advice. Last thing I want to say, sorry, I'm talking a lot, but it happens. I used to have this like fantasy of blast emailing all the partners at McKinsey and say, stop sending the same letter for the person every year. Sorry, McKinsey, but it was like, we kept getting the same ones that were essentially, it's like every year you have the most extraordinary person ever and you're using the same kind of language. Like, it needs to also feel real. So some people have gotten in spite of their, despite their letters of recommendation, because they were like, this didn't give me much information and it was a form kind of letter and didn't tell me much. So we're going to take a chance on that. And so many people will assume that if I follow and use this person that wrote for somebody else. So there's a lot that has to be unpacked there, I think, in terms of identifying the right person and getting advice from other people who are like, this is what some people got in despite their essays, believe it or not, where the recommendations were so, they don't usually do that. But, there's sometimes where it's like, okay, so I'm curious. I want to interview this person just to see if there is something there, because I suspect there might be. And so be careful about who you listen to, who you get advice from, and what their perspective might be. If it's only informed by their own experience, I'd be wary of that. So well-intentioned.
With that idea of the curiosity that piques the interest. And from there, you've gone from a 1 in 11 chance of admission to Harvard Business School. You've secured an interview, which means that you're now among, 1,700, 1,800 applicants, and perhaps a 1 in 2 chance. I'd love to get both of your perspectives, starting with Alterel. Of course, you were on the candidate side of the interview. Talk just briefly about that experience and how you think candidates can best prepare it.
It was so nerve-wracking. It was probably the most nervous I've ever been for an interview. To the story, I think, Carla, you may have mentioned, I forgot a tie. I had to go to Harvard Square to get one. Like, all of the worst things happened that day. So in terms of preparing, I try to tell folks to think about a few key things that you want the interviewers to walk away knowing about you, because you can easily try to practice everything, but they're so smooth at asking you things that you don't expect. And one of the things that really took me for a loop was, you'll be on one road and they'll ask you a question on a totally different road that feels like they are trying to make sure that you're being honest. And it was so quick that you're thinking, I don't have time to lie. Right. And so, and I think that might be the purpose. And so I would say, there is a way to over practice for your HBS interview. And so I think I reached a point of just feeling this is too much. I just need to go in and just be myself. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Now, that is not an approach that can work for everybody. But I say that to say that, have your key things that you want folks to walk away knowing about you. But you also have to know yourself. I'm a nervous wreck. And I know that if I overdo it, I'm going to be my worst self. So if that's you, give yourself a calm down routine before it happens, because maybe you're going to sound like a robot if you're too rehearsed, and you don't want to do that. So you have to look back to how have you interviewed and how do you best show up? And I would say practice with other people to see what's working and what's not working, because you might not know that you say a word a lot that is actually quite off-putting. And maybe the last thing I would say that I heard from a few folks that I did mock interviews with who were at HBS when I was a candidate was to focus on telling short stories. And then if they have more questions, they'll ask you for more. And so I was really used to just giving the expansive view and trying to really get clear on sort of like practicing the case thing of say enough. And if they want more, they'll tell you they want more.
Great advice. Now, of course, Carla, you met many of those candidates in that nervous situation. I'm sure you're aware of that. Can you build a rapport in 30 minutes for the interview?
It depends. I think just to sort of echo what was said earlier, that what's most important is that the two things that, again, I was essentially trained to look for was, does it make sense? Does it sound true? Do you have to have the best answer ever? No, you don't. That's not what we're solving for here. And I think that's what some people get confused on, is that they practice and they script if you're scripted, you're already putting yourself at a disadvantage. So it is possible to over prepare. It's almost like you want to have bullets of, how do I tell this story? But you don't want to memorize anything, because you can tell. And then as soon as what they do, oftentimes, different interviewers have different styles, but what is consistent is that you may be interrupted. It's really difficult to hold it together if you're interrupted. And so they're not, and then people panic, because it's like, I must have done something wrong, or I'm talking too long. Stop making assumptions and just answer the question that's being asked. So many times we would hear answers that was like a politician's answer. It was like, did that have anything to do with what I just asked that person? But they definitely prepared that. And that's not going to fly. That's not going to be valuable, because you have to be someone for HBS for that to be a good fit. You're going to have to be someone who is put on the spot and who is able to articulate a point of view. Yes, you'll have some preparation, but you have to be nimble. You have to be flexible. You have to be able to shift and change, and they will come at you from different directions. And it's not because they're trying to trick you. They're trying to get to the bottom of what's real, what's true, does it make sense? And what did you learn about that? And they may ask you 6 questions in one. Just remember the first question and answer that. And then also, if you get a question out of the blue that scares you, or that you draw a blank on, you can do something like, wow, that's a really interesting question. Let me think about that. And then think about it. That shows confidence. Some people that just open their mouth and then it's just, I don't know what just came out of their mouth, but it's a stream of consciousness. Being succinct and pithy is absolutely essential to being able to show them that you got the communication skills that will be valuable in the classroom. And so for some people, that's harder than others. It's difficult for me, but my strategy was like, you got to interrupt me. You got to stop me, because I'll go on for days if I'm allowed to. And that's just who I am. And I'm aware of it. But that doesn't mean that it always solves that problem. But we found strategies around that, and I loved it there. And knowing that about myself, made it so that people didn't feel bad interrupting me when they needed to. So it was, again, this isn't about me, but the whole point here is that if you can just be honest and tell the truth and not have to prepare some beautifully coiffed answer where it's like everything is just, it sounds like an essay, you could tell the difference. It's like almost like someone was pressing play in their head of something that they memorized. And so you lose points there. Maybe you get in, but the best ones are just straightforward, direct answers, honest answers. But then there's other things too, where you might get a question around, what was the most difficult manager that you ever had? And tell us about that experience. You never want to throw anyone under the bus. You can talk about what didn't work for you. So there's all kinds of strategies that you can use. And once you have these strategies and tools and know, how do I stay within the bounds while also being real and honest? Then you can actually go in there and feel, I'll be fine. They can come at me from any direction. I told the truth of my application. I'm not fabricating anything. I can talk about all the points on my resume. And also, you can drive a lot of the conversation that they're going to have with you by what you put in the application. So you can be strategic there too. So, if you don't want to talk about a particular deal, you don't have to necessarily include it. Or if you're worse, like sometimes we would pick at stuff and it was like, why did you even tell us about this if you clearly don't want to talk about it? So you again can be strategic in many different aspects of it. And what I try to do, and what Fortuna and other coaches try to do, is just help you really get comfortable, again, with what are the stories, where have you struggled, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Those are ones that, like, obviously you're going to have wanted to prepare. So they want you to prepare, but they don't want to have someone who is so afraid of just being put on the spot that they have to memorize what they're expecting. And it makes your life a lot easier, knowing that you can just go in there and have whatever questions that they might have about you. It's like, you told us a lot about this, tell us more about it. Or, I'm curious about, what do we not know about you? What would surprise us about you too? So there's a bunch of different things that can happen, but there's no one set interview. It is built on what you provide them and what they're seeking to know more, because they're never going to know everything going in. So
right. Now, we've packed so much into the last hour, and I have two very short answers, one for each of you. Alterel, as we think about round one and the upcoming admissions cycle, good ways to connect with the school and the alumni. And then Carla, just a final word on new leadership at Harvard Business School, because of course, Roel was herself an HBS, class of, I think, 2006. Anyway, she stepped into that role. So I'd love you to comment on that. But Alterel, just in terms of connecting with the school, with alumni, being respectful of their time, just a few words about how our viewers can make the most of that interaction.
For sure. So one of the things that I highly recommend is trying to go to a conference for a club that you might be interested in. So I was interested in retail, and I was able to go to the retail conference. That's something that you can do. I think also trying to find students who are interested in a career path that you want, which you can do via LinkedIn. That's how I was able to figure it out. I also reached out to most of the clubs where I was interested in going to school, just to sort of network and understand how friendly they were. I wanted to feel a sense of, what would it be like for me to be on campus, and if I can talk to people. Every single school within maybe 3 days was able to put me in touch with someone who was willing to talk to me about something. And so I think, be mindful of what you're asking of people, because they are still students. But I found that it was helpful, and that actually helped me pare down my list of schools that I wanted to go to, because I thought, I don't know if I'm vibing with what I'm getting from this school. I don't know if I want to be a part of this alumni community. So I would say that it's also a great way to get a feel for, are these your people or not?
Yeah. And new leadership, Carla, do you think that will herald changes?
So the thing is that there is a core set of individuals who've been part of this, operations. They're behind the scenes. And so new leadership, yes, there's change. And certainly I think what I really respect and appreciate about HBS is how it does also do a lot of self-analysis and bring in different kind of leadership so that they can also change and grow. There's been a lot of changes too with the Supreme Court decision. And so what that has meant for how they do the process, how do they continue to have a diverse environment of people from all different walks of life, it's not going to be interesting, or you're not going to learn much. A true education comes from encountering difference, right? So you're going to really learn more. So there is a core set of individuals who've been there, who were there when I got there and had been there for a long time, and they're still there. And so there is that continuity, but then the new leadership is trying to continue to improve and look for ways to identify individuals who may not have ever imagined that they would ever end up at a place like HBS. There's so many different sectors that I think HBS will serve. It's not just about being a factory for Fortune 500 CEOs. It does still do that really well, but there's all kinds of other opportunities in different spaces, whether it's, someone who's going to be leading a refugee organization, those are things that actually happen now. And so I think that the new leadership is really tapped into that, and is helping to make sure that the school continues to be, not only relevant, but also holds true to, finding and doing outreach essentially for individuals that will continue to make the classroom experience and the case method experience incredibly valuable for everyone who's there.
Right. Wow. We have managed to cover so much. So I'm just going to close, I guess, with a couple of final thoughts. This was all about Harvard Business School, and I hope viewers, you enjoyed it as much as I continue to learn things about the school every time I sit down with Ultrel and with Carla. So it was a real treat for me too. And coming up in the next couple of weeks, we have additional masterclass sessions at Fortuna. The next one, which will be on May 2nd, and that's going to focus on Stanford GSB, which has also announced a new admissions director. And then a week after that, how to get into the Wharton School. And of course, with so many colleagues at Fortuna that used to work in these schools, bringing the level of insight that you've just shared with us in the last hour. So we hope that you'll be able to sign up and join us for that. Otherwise, of course, it's available among the many resources that Fortuna puts together. We really draw on this level of insider expertise and experience, whether that's on the YouTube channel or just an absolute array of blogs covering every aspect of the schools and these different pieces of the admissions puzzle. I mentioned signing up for a free consultation and just how seriously we take those consultations. The consistent feedback again and again is that people are blown away by the sort of discussions that we're able to have to really take that deeper dive and talk about you and your story, where business school fits in, whether it's HBS or any of the other of the world's top MBA programs. So we'll hope that you enjoy all of this. Certainly, thanks for staying for the last hour. And finally, to thank both Carla and Ultrel for such a great session. Thanks to Poets and Quants for hosting us too.